Hey everyone, it's Reese here, and I'm here today to talk about preparing readings. So throughout time at academia, you'll be asked to prepare for lectures, prepare for seminars, prepare readings, film materials, etc. But how should you prepare? What should you be doing to make sure that you've prepared well? And that is what I want to talk about today. So to begin, what is the value of preparing? Well, broadly speaking, it means that you're able to consolidate more what you've done. It means you're able to go to lectures, you're able to go to seminars, you're able to go to workshops and get more out of them. So it's a chance really for you to sort of prepare, to sort of begin interrogating the material you're working with, to begin to sort of think about it yourself in relation to lectures and sessions you've already had or ones that are coming up. It's a chance to sort of dig into the stuff that you're working with. With that in mind, then the key thing I would say is make sure that you actually do the reading. If you're given primary material to read, then make sure to try and read it. And I'm saying reading here is sort of all encompassing. It might be something to listen to, might be something to watch, but make sure you actually read it and engage with it. Exactly how you should do that I'm going to talk about in this video. There are different levels of detail depending on things like time and depending on sort of your priorities with the piece, but sort of it's always best to do it. And what I would say is if you're not able to do it, sort of being honest about it rather than trying to blag, because sort of that's not useful. Most lecturers, you want to do stuff, and if you haven't done it, we're not going to sort of rake you over the coals, but just sort of be honest with it. We can get away with that. We can sort of help you understand. We can ask questions that will be useful to the class, but I'd say sort of actually do the material to whatever extent you're able to do it, in whatever detail you're able to do it, and don't try and bluff if you haven't. So let us inch forward. And when you're doing readings, you're often invited to pick out the good bits, pick out the useful bits, etc. But the question is, how do you know what the good bits are? How do you know what will be useful? And I think there are sort of multiple ways that you can guide a reading to sort of try and pull out things that you think will be directly relevant. So ask yourself, firstly, why are you reading this material? Everything that you've read on a uni, if it's a primary text, it will probably have been chosen for you. Secondary texts are likely to have been curated for you as well. So if a material is primary, why is it primary? If it's a key source on a module, why is it a key source? Thinking about sort of its position, if it's a module about feminism, how does the text link to that module? And by that logic as well, sort of how does it link to other texts on the module, other readings that you've done on the module? How does it link to the lecture that is linked to the text? How does it link to seminars that are linked to the text? Think about sort of the text in its own right, yes, but also in relation to what you've been doing on the course, on the module, on your degree. Because if something is chosen with some degree of importance, there will be a rationale behind it. So think about what that rationale is. And often that can point you in the way of sort of finding the useful elements. And you can do this, before and while you're preparing a reading, but also do it afterwards as well. Sort of if there were particular examples that were good or useful, make sure to highlight them and keep a record. The second thing I would think about is sort of the have you been given seminar questions? What was your lecture topic? Because those can really curate. If there's a lecture question about how an author does, I don't know, how does it show this character is nasty, whatever. Are there relevant quotes? Are there relevant ideas, relevant examples that really speak to that particular question, that particular topic? If you sort of know what you're going to be asked about, or if you know the broad topics, you can choose useful elements, largely thinking about that in mind. And then I would also suggest thinking about sort of essays and assignments and stuff. If you know what your essay assignments are, or what your questions are going to be, rereading your text or preparing your text in advance with that knowledge in mind can again help you to focus down specifically on what you're looking for. If you know you're going to be writing an essay on, I don't know, let me pick out sort of representations of colour, say, then where are the references to that in your work? So having all these things, they can sort of help fashion you and tell you sort of what the useful elements are. And what I would suggest is, particularly as you go through modules and as you see sort of more examples, as you see the things that the lecturers and the seminar tutors speak about, look at all of those, and you'll start to get a sense of what is useful, as well as having all these pointers to sort of help you narrow it down. The next question to consider is how exactly you are reading and engaging with a text. And I think there are multiple ways that you can do this, all of which have their uses. There's not one that's inherently better, but the question is, what do you need to get out of a particular text? So, as I say, there are sort of four main ways. The first is to skim. Is to go over something in light touches. Is to scan for is to sort of try and find useful details. And it's really, really handy if you're trying to get an overview. It's really useful if you're sort of trying to get a general sense of a text or a resource. If you're doing that, sort of pulling out the key parts of a text. So if it's something written, probably the introduction and the conclusion, or the abstract, and will give you that sort of info. You can sort of skim. One step up from that, in terms of sort of level of detail, almost, is scanning a text. So you're sort of skimming over it, but you're doing so with an eye for particular things. You might be looking for reference to a particular name or whatever, and those sections you would read in more detail. So it's kind of like skimming, but it's a sense of you're looking for specific things. You're going over it generally, but you're sort of hyper-focused on particular things you're looking for. You would often do that in conversation with looking up the words or terms or whatever in the index, or using the Control F function or something like that, search bar, online textbooks. One step up again is sort of an intensive reading. So this is where you go through a text in sort of great detail, where you're sort of working hard to unpick the meaning of all the sort of examples and all the theory and sort of elements of a text. So this is generally more the case if it's something that's a primary text, or something that you're going to do an assignment on. It's something that you want to break down into greater detail. This ideally is what you would do for all primary texts, if the time allows. It can be a bit tough to do, because sort of going into sort of very intense detail may not always be time practical, but sort of ideally this is probably the level you're aiming for all your primary material. And then lastly, there's what I'd call sort of an extensive reading supply. So that is kind of looking around. That's looking at the secondary sources on your source list. That is looking at going to the library, seeing what else is on the shelf around a particular text, or on film databases or journal databases, or sort of those kinds of resources. Skimming over that material or scanning it to find things that are particularly relevant, but it's just giving you a sense of the wider context of it. Looking at module reading lists is a great way of doing that. And what I would say is, if you're curious about sort of what how to sort of get the most out of primary or secondary sources, I'm going to link to videos in the description where I have thoughts on both. But yes, think about how you want to read, and that really links into what you're trying to get out of the material you're working with. After you've done all of this work, the question is, what notes should you take? How should you be preparing these readings? Now, if you have specific questions to respond to, you should be pulling out examples, ideas that respond to those. But what if we're talking in a general sense? If you're preparing a reading for a seminar, where it's not specifically asking questions of that text in advance, or if you're preparing for an essay or that, how would you prepare that? So what I would say is pull out key ideas. What exactly are the key ideas, the key arguments, the key examples used in a particular reading? There will be there'll likely be sort of key through lines, there'll be key arguments. If it's a sort of an academic text, you're likely to have these sort of key arguments and key ideas listed out. If it's a primary text, it may be a little more challenging to pull that out, but try and identify what the key ideas of the text are and sort of key details about it. If there are any key references, if it sort of refers to specific pieces of writing, if it refers to specific time periods, specific people, etc., try and pull those out. In primary sources, are there obvious connections between that reading and other readings that you've seen? And always thinking about links as well, as so what the text is doing in itself, but also kind of those specific, the way that those links may be sort of connected to other things that you're seeing. And I would say sort of highlight key elements, make them sort of easy for you. And there are sort of different ways to do this, right? You might keep sort of a Word document or a Google Doc or whatever, where you can sort of literally type out your key examples, your key elements. You might, if you have your own copy of a work, you could write over it, you could highlight it, whatever. I personally am a big fan. I like paper text. So what you have here is my copy of Toby Hooper's Midnight Movie for a book I'm working on, and you can see I've sort of deliberately marked the pages. I've marked specific ideas and examples with sort of arrow notes to help me go back to them. However, it's best for you to sort of find a way to be able to sort of recall and bring out those elements that you deem important. Have them to hand. Because it's one thing to sort of know a text generally, it's one thing to know what it's arguing, but if you're able to pull on specific ideas, if you're able to identify a key example, if you're able to identify the page it's on, the point it's making, that will prove incredibly useful in the long run. And it's one of those things that will get easier and easier to do as time goes by. The last thing I would identify when you're preparing your reading is to sort of see where it stops, where the gaps are. And I think a really useful way of doing this is writing questions. Questions that you might want to take to a lecture or to a seminar, or questions that you might want to leave dangling for yourself. So either see if you can address them after you've had sort of the extra material and contact hours, or if you find them really interesting, questions you might want to address in assignments. So I'd ask yourself to look for sort of two key things in terms of questions, right? Firstly, are there elements of a text or a reading that you don't understand? Are there things where you're not quite seeing the point that's being made, where you're not seeing the logic, where you're not seeing the relevance? Are there things that you think are sort of that don't make sense? There's nothing wrong with that. I would say take those to staff, take those to seminars, and ask yourself, if there are gaps, if there are things that aren't making sense, sort of the challenge of trying to unpick them will be incredibly useful for sort of developing critical skills, and it will be useful essentially as a means of sort of understanding a text better. And then I would say secondly, think about the ideas that are there that you like, and also the ideas that you disagree with. Are there points the text or the reading is making that you think are really strong? Are there points that you think work really well and the evidence is great and the ideas are interesting, etc.? But also, are there things that you don't think work that well? Are there examples that are given that you think aren't that strong? Are there arguments you make where you think it doesn't work, or indeed it could have gone further? Often sort of critically interrogating these readings and trying to find the gaps and the things that you don't agree with, because it's very, very rare that you would ever fully 100% agree with everything a reading says, and there will always be gaps, as I've talked about in my secondary material video. So if you're able to sort of identify some of them and ask those questions again, that is an incredibly useful skill, and it's something that can serve as a topic in seminars and lectures. It's also something that is incredibly useful when you're sort of thinking about sort of the original thought elements of assessments. So there we go, some of my thoughts on preparing readings for lectures, seminars, assignments. Hopefully this is of some use, and I'm not going to claim that my ways are sort of the only ways you can do it. The key thing is finding a way that works for you and that enables you to get the most out of the readings and the text that you engage with. And if you're able to do that, and if you're able to do that well, then it will really, really help you in the long run as you sort of progress through a university degree. If you have any other ideas, please do comment below. I'd love to hear thoughts. I'd love to hear feedback. I'd love to hear things that you do as techniques that particularly work for you and might help someone else watching this. Otherwise, thank you so much for watching. And if you have any ideas for future videos that might be useful, please do comment below. Make sure to like, make sure to subscribe, make sure to ring the bell so you know when my new videos are coming. And thank you very, very much for watching, and I hope to see you all in the next one.